Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. St. John Henry Newman taught the church a lot of things: development of doctrine, primacy of truth, nature of conscience. Matthew Walz wants us to consider something else as well: what it means to hope in God as our Creator. Matthew will begin serving as the president of Thomas More College at the beginning of the upcoming academic year after almost 2 decades of teaching and administrative work at the University of Dallas and Holy Trinity Seminary. He begins in September, and he and his beautiful bride, Teresa, have been blessed with 8 children. Matthew, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well. Thank you, Marcus, for having me on again.
Oh, very glad. Always enjoy speaking with you. So, St. John Henry Newman, we remember him for a lot of things. So let's talk about some of his more known contributions to the life of the church.
Sure. So, of course, as many of the listeners probably know, John Henry Newman was made a doctor of the church last November, at the beginning of November. And he's known, of course, for writing many works. Among them, he did incredible work on the fathers of the church. He had a very historically grounded way of thinking. He's also known, in light of that, for his teaching on the development of doctrine. And of course, he's written many sermons, volumes of sermons. He wrote Lives of English Saints. So he was an incredibly productive and fruitful scholar. But maybe more than anything, people know him for his conversion. His actually probing the depths of Anglicanism and arriving at the truth that it was the Catholic Church, in fact, that was in continuity with the original church. And the Oxford movement that he began in that probing had deep influence on English Catholicism in particular and the church at large. But you can think of someone like G.K. Chesterton, for instance, as having read and learned much from Newman. So an incredibly influential thinker in the English sphere for sure, but also even someone like Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI, owed a lot to Newman when it came to his teaching on conscience, for instance. So an incredibly influential and wide-ranging thinker.
You raise crucial points about the nature of reason in the inquiry of the faith about Newman. But one of the things I want to ask you to speak to also, Matthew, is how you highlighted what it means to be a doctor of the church and the fact that he was named such.
Yeah, what really strikes me about that title, Doctor of the Church, which I got into a little bit in my article, was how do we take the of in that statement? On the one hand, he belongs to the church. So in that sense, he speaks on behalf of the church. He is a representative of the tradition of the church that's rooted in the scriptures. On the other hand, I think the one reason that we identify specific saints as doctors is not just that they represent the church, but they also teach the church. The church is the object of that saint's teaching. Of course, that teaching is rooted in revelation and the scriptures and tradition, but nonetheless, these saints bring out something very unique in those sources that, in some sense, has not been seen before. And we often give titles for that, like St. Augustine is the Doctor of Grace, because he taught something very unique that had not been seen before in the church's revelation. So I think what really strikes me, and when we think about doctors, is to really ask ourselves, what unique thing did this doctor bring that we want to be attentive to, and especially Newman right now, since he is the latest doctor of the church? Why is the church putting him forward as uniquely teaching the church something that the church in some sense had not seen before, at least with the clarity with which he brought?
As he's named Doctor of the Church, what are the areas in which he has uniquely received a kind of ancillary title? Like Aquinas is the angelic doctor. As you mentioned, Augustine is Doctor of Grace. What are the things we remember Newman for?
Well, certainly we remember him for the development of doctrine. In some ways, you might say that's the most obvious thing where he brought a new understanding of the way that the church over time unfolds the revelation that's been given to her, especially through controversy, and the way that heresy actually, in responding to heresy, the church actually develops its own deeper understanding of things. In a certain way, my article is trying to point out that if we were to give him a title, he hasn't been given a title like the Common Doctor yet or the Doctor of Grace, but I think if we were to give him a title, you could argue that it should be the Doctor of Truth. That in many ways, not only in his writings, but I would say maybe especially in his life, the way he lived and what he was willing to give up for the sake of truth. In a certain way, he gave up everything that he held dear. He gave up his family, his friends, his position in the Anglican Church, and became in a certain way a solitary figure. But as he expresses in his writings, never once doubted that he had made the right decision to align with the church in his attachment to truth itself. I could think of other titles. I tend to think Doctor of Truth would be a great one. Maybe one other one would be Doctor of Friendship. He was very dedicated to friendship. Even after he converted and lost many friends, he still tried to instill with new people friendship. So he was very dedicated to human relationships and friendships as well. But I would argue for Doctor Veritatis, the Doctor of Truth.
I think it's beautiful. I think if I didn't probe the mystery too deeply and I asked myself what areas I remember his contribution in my life, Doctor of Education, Doctor of Conscience, his writings on the place of conscience in the life of the church, I think are invaluable. So that raises a few questions about the way he thinks about hope and hope in God, which you highlight. This is a man who exercised the full breadth of his intellectual powers in probing the mysteries of the faith, and yet his heart was so in love with God that he was able to say, I hope in God, my Creator. Share with us about that.
Yes. So that phrase, hope in God the Creator, comes from a title of one of his meditations on Christian doctrine, as they're called. And in that meditation, we see that his hope is rooted in the fact that, as he puts it, and I love this phrase, right? It's both sort of homey but also deep, that God knows what he's about, that the Creator knows what he's about, and therefore we can trust him. And if we think about that phrase, what it means to know what one is about, to be so self-aware and self-possessed, and if you believe in God the Creator as a loving Creator, then in some ways our trust naturally is drawn out of us, that we, despite, you might say, the appearances sometimes in our life, that there is a plan, there is hope to be had in that trust in the one who knows what he's about. And I think this marks in a deep way the, for lack of a better word, the spirituality of Newman as a teacher and as a writer, that he himself imitates God in his knowing what he's about. And partly what he knew about himself, Newman I'm speaking of, is that he needed to learn, right? One thing that he came to see is just how little he did know already, and how able he was for, up to almost his 40th year to be under a certain kind of darkness in terms of his understanding of truth, and coming to realize that the truth was in the Catholic Church. So that awareness of knowing what we're about also means coming to grips with our ignorance in a deep way.
My guest is Matthew Walz. He'll begin serving as president of Thomas More College this September, and he's authored a great piece on John Henry Newman and what we can learn about Newman's heart for God. We're continuing on the other side. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with Matthew Walz. Matthew is the incoming president for Thomas More College, and he is also the author most recently of this article, Trusting the One Who Knows What He Is About. Matthew, one of the things that your title inspires, and in the mind of Newman this would be true as well, is that God perfectly knows himself. And that sounds like high-flying theology until we realize that our life in knowing God doesn't have to be this purely academic pursuit, because God knows himself perfectly. We can actually ask him to reveal himself to us.
Yes, that's a great point, Marcus. Actually, I was thinking about this in a certain way in preparation for this conversation this afternoon, and I was taken back to Exodus 3, when God reveals his name as I am who am, and the self-awareness, you might say, the full and complete self-knowledge that bespeaks that name of his, that I think Newman is trying to capture in this phrase, that he knows what he's about. I suggest in my article that the way that God actually reveals that to us, because I think you're right, like we should ask God to reveal himself to us. And in a certain way, I think God's answer is, often that comes with special graces, but also it might point us to the scriptures. Like in some ways, Jesus is the self-revelation of God. And so we can see in the life of Jesus what that kind of I am who am looks like when lived out in a human way. And I think Newman when he reads the Gospels, I imagine him at least seeing in Jesus that kind of self-awareness and self-possession. And I would ask any of the listeners to read the Gospels in particular with an eye to that. Like, what does it mean to see Jesus at every moment in a certain way in full possession of himself and full awareness of what he's doing and what he's about? And I think in some ways it really opens up the way that we hear him say that, like, I lay down my life freely, for instance, for you. Or, I do what the Father commands me because I want the world to know that I love the Father. Like, the Father must be known. So there's a way in which you can see in Jesus himself this sort of bubbling out of him, this desire that his heart be on full display for us. And in a certain way, the silence of the crucifixion is his greatest testimony of knowing what he's about. He knew that was going to happen to him and chose it nonetheless freely.
Newman understood this well. And so you see here what a mind committed to knowing the Lord and a heart committed to loving the Lord can look like. Can you please speak to our listeners about why that combination of virtuous development of the intellect and the innermost self in love of God is such a crucial component of the Christian life?
Yeah, that's a great point, Marcus. I think, in some ways it's so easy to sort of accept a distinction between the mind and the heart, or the head and the heart, as if there's a kind of lurking dualism, or that we're sort of two things. But as a matter of fact, both the heart and the mind, or you might say the will and the intellect, spring from the very sources of our being as an image of God. Right? God, in a certain way, there's kind of Trinitarian aspect to this, and I'm not saying anything new, but the mind, or the intellect, and the will are manifestations of our deepest reality as an image of God. And so Newman, I think, would use the language of the heart as sort of capturing that center of our existence. And he gets this, of course, from the Bible and the way the Bible talks about the heart, especially in the Psalms. But the heart, Newman, maybe the listeners should know that Newman's motto as a bishop was cor ad cor loquitur. Heart speaks to heart. And that's how I think he read the scriptures. That's how he prayed. The point of prayer, the point of scriptures is to allow our hearts, you might say the heart of God or the heart of Christ and our hearts to be mutually transparent to one another. That takes effort. We know it takes silence. It doesn't take effort in the sense of like we have to labor for it, but we do have to do the work, you might say, to dispose ourselves or to make ourselves available in our heart to the heart of Christ. That does take the effort, you might say, of silence, of putting away distraction, attentively reading the scriptures and allowing the heart of Christ to reveal itself to us as we reveal ours to him. A sort of, a spirituality of deep honesty, deep transparency to Christ.
One of the things I want to ask you to therefore also speak to is this reality of conscience then. In this great vulnerability you just spoke about, what does it mean to have a conscience that lives in submission to the Lord?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a hard question.
You've got 5 minutes.
But as you said a little earlier before the break, that one title that I think could compete with Doctor of Truth could be Doctor of Conscience for Newman. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, at least, maybe to put that in a certain kind of, historical context. Newman is in the mid to late 1800s as a thinker. So in a certain way, he's on the end of the modern movement towards the subject, right? And the sort of identity of the self as, regnant or supreme, even perhaps over truth itself. The modern ego, as we sometimes say. Now, I think what Newman sees is that there's, that kind of absolutization of the self is seriously problematic because we are creatures. So in some ways, we cannot be the center of being. Nonetheless, we're also images of the center of being. So we do image having a kind of center to ourselves. And conscience is a way of sort of naming that center. We could, as I said earlier, we could call that the heart, but naming it in terms of the way that we're present to ourselves as beings who make moral decisions. And in some ways, as Newman thinks, in part through revelation, that God is present to that decision-making. God knows the heart, as we're told over and over again. He knows the thoughts, our deepest thoughts. He knows us better than we know ourselves. So that kind of revelation sort of speaks to Newman in the sense of like seeing the need for us in light of this kind of absolutization of the self as a kind of self-legislator or even a self-creator, to oppose that with a sense of conscience that yes, we're free and our freedom is absolutely crucial, but our freedom is a created freedom, and the conscience is a guide in communion with God. It's the inner voice of God that can help direct us in a life that in some ways is bigger than we're aware of. And often we need to clarify our conscience in facing, say, big moral decisions by going to prayer, by putting our proposed decisions, perhaps you might say, at the altar or sanctuary before God and asking him to illuminate that, direct it, to guide it.
In your position, the one you're entering into, it's very clear that the only way you are moving forward is by a spirituality of trusting that the God who called you to this is giving you the grace for it. Newman exemplified that par excellence. He sacrificed so much and in a lot of ways endured a tremendous amount of ambiguity in moving forward. Can you please share with us that radical yet rational sense of trust he had in God?
Yeah, that's good. obviously, I mean, when you think of someone like Newman, all that springs from, a deep prayer life and a deep religious life, even a habits of building virtue of religion. Yes, I'm taking over I'm beginning as president of Thomas More College. I think it's actually kind of interesting to think about English Catholicism through the topics that we've just been discussing the last 10 minutes or so, because Newman sort of, as you mentioned, he gives up everything for the sake of entering the church and leaving behind, in a certain way, his beloved Church of England and all his friends and family. On the sort of front end of modernity, you have Thomas More doing the same thing before Anglicanism is sort of in full takeover mode of England. So I think there's actually a very interesting complementarity to Thomas More and St. John Henry Newman as almost like bookends of modernity in England. And I think one of the questions that I've been asking myself as an incoming president of Thomas More College is to ask, what does English Catholicism in particular bring to the table as maybe something really fitting for our time? And I think it has to do with this sense of truthfulness to the self, the conscience, and freedom. And you see that, you might say, in an incredible and excellent way in both St. Thomas More and St. John Henry Newman.
Matthew, tremendous joy as always. I've been talking to Matthew Walz, incoming president of Thomas More College, about St. John Henry Newman. I'm Marcus Peter.